Welcome to Political News and Views with Congressman Ed Towns of Brooklyn, New York, representing the 10th Congressional District, programming with your concerns in mind. And now, your host, Congressman Ed Towns.
Welcome to News and Views. I'm delighted today to have with us Donald Payne of the 10th Congressional District in New Jersey, who is our guy on Africa. When the Congressional Black Caucus, has an issue that they want to discuss or anything they want to do with Africa, they do not move until they contact Donald Payne. He's our point man on Africa. Also delighted to have with us Julius Coles, who is the president of Africare. And it's delighted to have both of you on. I understand, Julius, you just returned from Africa?
Yes, I made a trip out to South Africa to look at our programs in the Eastern Cape. And then we went up to Uganda to look at what we're doing in HIV/AIDS programs and also in the Tanzania. So it was really a great trip. I enjoyed very much. It was a very informative trip also for me.
Right. Have you been lately?
Yes, as a matter of fact, 3 weeks ago I was in South Africa too, in Cape Town at a meeting of the Interparliamentary Union, which is a group of 150 countries, speakers and leaders of their parliament and congresses, and I was asked to address that international annual meeting of the group. Prior to my trip to South Africa several weeks ago, I did visit in January Kenya, the problems there after following the elections. I visited South Sudan and also went to Eritrea, which is a troubled state.
Right, still having problems up there, huh?
Yes.
Yeah. Let me ask you, how did you get involved in the whole issue of Africa? Because you devoted a lot of your life into Africa and even spent time in the region.
Well, it's a very interesting story. It goes back to my days in college. I was a student at Morehouse College, and some of the students were very actively involved in the civil rights movement and in the student movement, and we were trying to desegregate the city of Atlanta and throughout the South at that time, but we also had ties to Africa. And so there were people who had gone on Operation Crossroads Africa from my college who came back to the school and told me about what their experience was all about. So I was secretary of the student government at that time, engaged in some local politics, as they say, and I convinced the student body to give me $1 to send me to Africa my first visit. It was in 1961. It was my first trip. So I was only 19 years old at that point, but that was the beginning of a love and fascination for the African continent. So for some 47 years, I have been working on the African continent in one way or another.
Right. What about you, Don? How did you get so interested in Africa?
Well, it was during the civil rights movement, too. I'm maybe a year or two older than our colleague here. And there was a combination between what was happening in the civil rights movement and really the independence movement in Africa, all following World War II. And I was a teacher of history in the middle 50s, and so I just had a natural connection. I remember when Ghana became independent and Dr. Martin Luther King went, and I did participate with some of my youngsters. I was involved in the YMCA, and it was a worldwide organization, always has been, and we used to do things like they call world service. So I would get my high school kids to get involved, and then I sent one of my students over to Operation Crossroads too, Reverend Robinson,
right, out of New York,
and a Jewish rabbi came together, and that was the beginning of the Kennedy administration took that model and started the Peace Corps.
Right.
From that, and Reverend Proctor became the deputy undershriver, and so this connection of Operation Crossroads was really a tremendous opportunity that you had being at Morehouse and the involvement there.
Right, and this year, Crossroads Africa is celebrating its 50th anniversary. Mm-hmm. It's going to be celebrating in New York, and they're also going to be celebrating in Washington.
Yeah.
But it's a way that many African Americans first became involved with the continent of Africa, and it's just a great organization.
Right. Now let's talk about some of the problems. AIDS. According to the statistics, that there's a serious problem with AIDS, and what can we do to sort of begin to stem that? I mean, everywhere you go, people talk about how many people in Africa, that have the virus, and that the fact that what will happen over the next 15 to 20 years if something is not done about it. I mean, the millions that will be wiped out as a result of it. What can we do, or what is being done to address the problem?
Do you want to talk about it first from a legislative point of view?
Yeah, let me just talk about it legislatively. You know, there was very little being done as related to treatment, as it relates to the virus. Somehow the Bush administration was convinced, after the Congressional Black Caucus and Barbara Lee and others of us, Dr. Christian, talked about the problem. It kind of fell on deaf ears internationally. The reason was, well, it's just going to be too costly and we don't have the money for medication. But I think some evangelical church people who had President Bush's ear talked about the mother-to-child transmission, and these were sort of right-to-life people, sort of religious, southern, white, right of the spectrum, actually, politically. But they were able to convince the president that there should be, in addition to this abstinence and education, that we really should get involved a bit in treatment, at least the prevention of mother-to-child transmission. That's where it all began. And he was then, convinced to start the PEPFAR program, which deals not only with HIV and AIDS, it deals with malaria and tuberculosis. We were able and very pleasantly surprised that even with the low funding, the administration came up with a $15 billion 5-year program, which sort of shocked many of the Republicans and caught some of us pleasantly by surprise. That 5 years is about ready to expire. And I was able to meet with President Bush and with some of the people on our committee, where we have passed through the House $50 billion 5-year reauthorization of PEPFAR, it's called, which will deal with malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV and AIDS. There's a new extreme tuberculosis, XDR and MDR, multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis.
Yes.
You have now the malaria, the war on malaria. So we've been able, in the new PEPFAR, $50 billion bill, is to get nutrition in there, clean water, medication, things that were not in it before. So this, if we can get it through the Senate and get it signed into law, this $50 billion 5-year reauthorization would really be a great step.
It would truly make a difference.
Really very, very pleasantly surprised that we actually had negotiations with the White House to convince some of the Republicans who were totally opposed to this kind of a quantum leap. And not only do we have the 15 countries in Africa, we have brought in 15 Caribbean countries. See, up to now, PEPFAR only dealt with Africa and Haiti and Vietnam. Now we have the whole 15 Caribbean countries, 3 additional African countries, and so we have about 35 countries in the new PEPFAR reauthorization, up from the 15.
That's good news.
Yeah, it's good news.
Well, what is your strategy in terms of dealing with the AIDS issue?
Well, we have a very comprehensive strategy. Yeah. In fact, we've been involved in AIDS programs going back to the 1980s, even before the legislation of PEPFAR came into force. And we're looking at, not only we're looking at testing, we're looking at counseling, we're looking at treatment, we're looking at a comprehensive approach to the AIDS program. We're also involved in orphans and vulnerable children, and we have maternal child health that are specifically directed at women. So our whole approach to the AIDS pandemic is a very comprehensive approach. We're working at the grassroots level. We're giving counseling to people. We're giving treatment. We have a very comprehensive approach, and we've also benefited from about $30 million for the PEPFAR program in terms of working in South Africa, Mozambique, Rwanda, Uganda, and Tanzania. So it's a very comprehensive approach. And we've also got some PEPFAR funds to work in Nigeria with the WISE program and working with special programs directed at women. So I'm very, very pleased with the level of program activity that we have and with the resources. And hopefully with this new $50 billion that's being provided, that we'll be able to expand our programs throughout the continent of Africa.